Welcome to this week's edition of Insights. This is your host, Eric Hacopian. What we're going to be discussing this week is the continued crisis in our borders and the international reaction to it and the domestic reaction to it. First, I want to give everyone an update about what's been going on since last week. As we had feared, in fact, this situation at the Syunik border has actually grown to other spots in our borders, specifically in Karakunik province, which is north of Sevanlich. At least in two locations, Azeri armed troops have done what they did on the Syunik border and Sevanlich, which means that they have advanced clearly and directly into Armenian territory. This is the estimated number of troops from the other side is somewhere between 300 to 500 troops, depending on who's counting. Since last week, there has been no shootings or any clashes at the borders that has involved essentially any kind of heavy fire, or any fire actually. And there have been ongoing negotiations between the Armenian, the Azeri, and the Russian sides to bring this issue to an end and to lead to the withdrawal of the Azeri forces from Armenian territory. What we do know from reports on the ground is that there's significant Russian military presence along with the Armenian one, specifically in Syunik. And I've heard countless reports that they're actually in our positions along with our soldiers. What the Ministry of Defense has been saying is that the Azeri advances are entirely enveloped or blockaded by our troops, which means they don't have supply lines to be able to resupply the troops that they have on our territory. But frankly, as we have learned, everything that comes out of the Ministry of Defense should be doubted. In fact, I would say that nothing should be believed until they officially deny it. What we learned this morning, in fact, a few minutes ago, there was a governmental meeting which was televised, in which the Prime Minister said that there's actually an agreement being worked out in regards to the demarcation issue and the withdrawal of the Azeri troops from our territory. Frankly, this is brand new news, so we don't really know too much about it, and we will update you as the days go on, and specifically in next week's show. I think as we've moved into this crisis, I think we're getting a more clear picture of what the Azeri agenda is here. I think what they want to do is to do anything that does not allow normalcy to take place. And they have a much more difficult time in actually creating discomfort in the Artsakh-Azerbaijani border because of the Russian troop presence here. So it's much easier to do it on the actual borders with Armenia proper. They understand that the current moment is the moment of greatest advantage and the greatest disadvantage for us because of the political crisis and the general disorganization of the state and the military. So they're trying to cause as many problems as possible not to allow normalcy to occur, which in the long run is not in their favor and is in our favor. When you look at the specifics of this border incursions, I think what this really is to create more points, more chits that they can use in future negotiations. Just like they're holding our POWs as hostages, it becomes another thing to get what they want from us. The object is not to grab that 1 kilometer here, 1 kilometer there. It does not change anything dramatically in the broader political context, but it becomes another point that they can use against us. And frankly, this is something that we handed to them by having a state that is incompetent and a military that is incompetent, that is incapable of basically guarding our borders. So this is something that we handed to them, which we had no business giving them as an advantage. Third point is, I think given the fact that we're going through elections, they want to be able to interfere in our internal affairs as much as possible, to cause dissension, to cause problems, because any kind of effect like that obviously lessens the ability of the state and delays the process of reorganizing and strengthening our state and our military positions and posture. The likely, and the fourth most likely reason for this is probably long-term frustrations that they have with the current situation in Artsakh. I think from the Azeri perspective, what they really wanted to do is to do essentially to turn Artsakh into another Gaza, isolated from the world, with an unlivable place that people would want to leave. And I think that is become very hard to accomplish given what's really going on there. And the fact that they'll have a hard time challenging the security situation in Artsakh without coming into direct confrontation with the Russian forces, which is something they certainly do not want to do. Now I'm going to move on to the international reaction to this Azeri incursion and invasion of proper Armenian territory. I'm going to start with the United States, who 5-6 days ago, the United States State Department released an almost disgraceful statement in which they asked neither side to do anything in disputed territories. Well, as we know, there's nothing disputed about these territories. These are territories that were well within Armenia. This was somewhat corrected 2 days ago by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in his conversations with both President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan, in which he urged for the Azeris to withdraw from occupied Armenian territories and for this issue to be resolved peacefully. From the United States, we can move on to the EU. And I think, to be fair, outside of France and Lithuania, the EU response has been disgraceful or non-existent. It is almost remarkable that they have nothing to say about this. And after much coming and going from Yerevan saying they want to be engaged, they cannot make solid statements about the most simple things. In the case of France, I think this is actually something exceptional that we should discuss. President Macron has been very outspoken, in fact, even offering to go to the UN Security Council on this issue. And I think one thing that's very clear is among all the major European leaders, President Macron is the only one that I think clearly understands the dangers of this new Ottomanism, the new Turkish militancy, or for lack of a better phrase, their sort of neo-fascist approach to their foreign policy. He is the only Western leader that understands that and is willing to call them out it and act on it. So I think he should be commended on that. From there, we move on to Russia. The Russians have, again, troops on the ground on our side. We know that in Sunik. We know a couple of days ago, last week in fact, the Sesto Treaty was triggered, which obligates primarily Russia, because that's really the primary mover of Sesto, to defend Armenian territory. And I think there's been a lot of criticism about why they're not moving more proactively and more aggressively. And frankly, I think some of this is unwarranted. It is not the Russians' job to guard our borders. It is our job to guard our borders. Yes, if there's a full-on invasion of Armenia, yes, they should meet their treaty obligations. But it is not their job to stand guard. It's not their job to be prepared and to act in basically being on guard to make sure you don't have ridiculous things like the opposing enemy army advancing 2-3 kilometers into your territory without anyone knowing about it. Now we're going to move on to Iran. And this has been quite interesting because outside of France, the country that has been most strongest and eloquent in taking what I would say is the Armenian side of this equation, which is a very simple one, that the enemy has to leave our territories, has been Iran. The Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif said that Armenia's state boundaries is a red line as a matter of policy for the state of Iran. And the person who's the chair of the Foreign Policy Committee in the Iranian parliament, Mujtaba Zornur, made a very strong statement, essentially protecting Armenia's territorial integrity and saying this is a very important policy position for the state of Iran. I want to start closing our show with some questions that I have for our current Prime Minister, Mr. Pashinyan. You constantly refer to negotiations. Can you explain to us what is being negotiated and why are we negotiating? Because ultimately, if the enemy crosses your borders, the only thing to negotiate is when they're leaving. And if you're negotiating anything but when they're leaving, essentially their invasion is being rewarded and being used for other purposes, which is not a pattern that you want to set, especially with hostile totalitarian states. My second question for you is, why have you not spoken directly to the country? You're the leader of the country. People need to hear from you. They need to know what's going on at the border. They need to know what you're doing about it. And televising government meetings is not enough. People need to know what's going on in our country and specifically in our borders. And lastly, I want to know who is responsible for these border breaches. Can you identify who on the NSS side and the Army side was responsible for these areas that the enemy broached our borders? And what has been done to these people? Have they been relieved from their job? Have you put in new people? And as a final total point, obviously all of this leads to reforming our military. We all know that reforming the military starts with getting rid of the incompetent leadership right now and replacing them with younger junior officers that performed well during the war. Where are you in that process? What are you doing to reform our military? Because reforming our military is the first, second, third job of any government in Armenia right now, whether it's you or if we have a new prime minister by the end of June. In my closing thoughts, I've been thinking a lot about this the last couple of days, given the state of our military, and I was thinking, what would Monty Melkonyan, Marshal Bahramian, or Vazgen Sarkisian think of our military leadership today? I think one of the most tragic things that we have witnessed since the war, outside of the people that we lost in the war, is to the extent that the current military leadership has disgraced the tremendous martial tradition that the Armenian people have. We are a nation that has produced military leaders far above our numbers. In fact, military technologies far above our numbers during the Soviet period. And I think that is one of the most disgraceful things that we have seen. All of this leads back to one thing. We can regain that martial tradition, but it will begin with reforming our military and rebuilding our state. Thank you for joining me in this week's edition of Insights with Eric Hacopian.